Whilst some believe that our universe is of no more consequence than a single atom in a solar system, others suppose that innumerable universes exist, each with their own intelligent life, their own model of reality, and their own laws of nature. With so much on offer, perhaps, we should consider the possibility of a universe with only 2 dimensions, or one with 20, or a cosmos in which the past, present and future all exist at once. Something as fanciful as a universe where inhabitants exist as multiple entities simultaneously, and travel between the worlds is instantaneous. Places on the other side of the Big Bang, where all the clocks run backwards, and ruined castles rebuild themselves. I think that there are far stranger things than anything human mathematicians or astrophysicists have come to dream of. When I try to expand my mind to visualize the infinite possibilities, it brings me right back to the 2 most important atoms, the 2 that bind us together in the single molecule of a relationship. This journey is about some of those relationships, and another universe, a very real place where the unholy houses of our worries have roses around the door, and every good strand in our life is a creeping stone bramble. With many lights in sight at sea, and all sails set for east, many stars were on me as I sank into my seat. If I should make to count them all, would we get there any sooner? As sozzled as a sherry pirate aboard a bawdy schooner. The stars were a deep rose as they set over the mountains. The scent of smoky ash wafted across the valley. Off the soft sandy flanks of the coast, the fresh southeast trade winds were blowing up, and the sky was bearing down red on the blue water. As brimstone butterflies fluttered their emerald wings under the palms, 2 burly sailors pulled us up onto the plank. Frosty Jack welcomed us aboard. With hands like bunches of bananas and a vice-like grip, he squeezed my hand tighter and tighter until I could feel my bones fusing together. With his brown, leathery face and watery eyes veined with red, I recognized him as a furious drinker. His face was vaguely gypsy-like. With his fierce pride and the heavy bronze chain that hung heavy round his neck, I saw a sailor of fortune. He smashed the starter lever down, and the engines woke. The big wooden propeller turned the stern water into a guttering whirlpool, and the low hum of the engine rose to a steady bum, 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 bum. After walking through the shape scanner to check our clothing for firearms, explosives, and other dangerous materials, I stood still and looked around the boat. I still couldn't believe it. There it was, floating beneath my feet, the ship that Captain Morgan had built in an age when craftsmen loved the excitement of creation, be it only plank upon plank. Its eternal charm culled from the ancient red wood trees of Phantom Valley. Magnetic north was displayed clearly on the ship's compass, which floated freely in a pool of mercury. Long and beautiful curved glass windows looked out onto topiary hedges and a lily pond, which had turned stagnant. The dry fountains once soaked a carefully trimmed croquet lawn. What still worked was way too expensive to maintain legitimately, but then the laws of the land didn't apply there. "For God's sake, get some coal on the engine," Captain Morgan cried. Morrison, the sergeant-at-arms, walked mincingly down the decks on his Minnie Mouse legs, with an ermine fur around his long, thin neck. The rest of him was a crisis of red crimpline. From a hair-net prison, brittle blue hair escaped in all directions, a small roseate face puckered up, and blew kisses in the air as he spoke. "Oh, I love it when you decry me, sir." "So shut up then, boyo," shouted the captain, while chasing down the wooden steps. his hair a tree of nests with ropey black eyebrows bristling below. He was a bloodful man, with a chest full of campaign medals, a long bony jaw, and a separate temperament that acted tough all of the time, roaring and ranting, threatening to sink the ship with all aboard, which, when said, tickled him so much he went into little barefooted dances. Captain Morgan came with a side order of a man, a poisonous dish that was at least a quarter of his own size, delivered in the form of a parasitic Siamese twin who answered to the name of Horatio Brownstone. This chap seemed to live quite happily in the warm, wet safety of Morgan's armpit, or lubber's hole, as he lovingly called it. The pair were almost identical, although Brownstone, being the younger by 2 days, hadn't fully formed in the womb. His 2 legs were perfect, finished with little feet and toes, but unfortunately his arms were rudimentary, with just 2 fingers on each hand. For a time during the icy trips, the captain had grown timid and withdrawn, and so visited a gastrointestinal surgeon who had explained that Brownstone shared his heart, liver and spleen, and that he would live for a few years and then die of natural causes. As a result of the affliction, he was completely spineless, and as such, spent most of the time gouging out, swimming in and out of Morgan's flouncy shirt, giving all that saw him the idea that he was dancing with a limpid corpse. For Morgan, it was a 1 in a million life-threatening condition. For Brownstone, it was a life, and although bad-natured and a well-known kleptomaniac, the captain loved him deeply and played with him like a small baby. A blessing and a curse, they would say. Viewed upon with fear and wonder, they were a pair who drew crowds when they went to the temple to pray together, and with every year that passed, Brownstone continued to grow by half a stone inside his brother. And so they had learned to fight each other for space, and progressed to beat their victims, who were many. Although muskets and swords were abundant on the Treherbert, Brownstone wore a pair of child-sized boxing gloves, though not to protect any unwilling opponent. Morgan had sewn them onto his hands to prevent him taking the tops off the bottles of the ship's smelling salts, which he was constantly trying to sniff. I held on to Grace's hand, and we watched as Brownstone muddled a whole cabbage from the table and tossed it around with all the voraciousness of a bull terrier until the rotten vegetable got the better of him, and he retreated back to Lubber's Hole, where he lolled around like a flatulent sea lion. It was when the captain boarded crystal ships looking for loose loot that Brownstone really came alive. He would brace himself solid and assume the position of a car wing mirror, and, while the captain dashed along the decks, severing hands and heads like a super cyclone, Brownstone would batter any dandies who attempted to take the captain's flank. He was also a master in the art of bin raiding, swinging down from his pit like a jackal, scooping up armfuls of food scraps, whilst spraying a rare stench from the anal pouch on his belly. Whenever he broke into one of his night sweats, which could be any time of the day, Morgan would reach inside his blouse and with a lacy handkerchief wipe the mucus from Brownstone's wet nose. So he loved the captain to death, and after each mopping would give him a liberal dot-to-dot of kisses on his bare chest before disappearing back under his armpit for a sleepy daydream. To me it looked as though the Morgan-Brownstone brothers had been a 3-year pregnancy. So beautifully round, vast and tight they were, just like a space hopper. They also had an allergy to cheap drinks. Giving them booze was like priming a double-barreled human cannon. It could all go off at any given moment. And who needs suicide bombers when you have spontaneous twin bombers? Who's going to argue? They would waddle into a bar, and Morgan would shout, "Give us something stiff from the top shelf, or I'll produce more bodies," while Brownstone would yelp piteously. "Watch him when he's got wood. I can feel it stabbing me in the back." Grace didn't flutter her eyelashes like she normally did. When the wind changed direction, her face was smiling, pitying, patient, and disgusted all at once. It was a trained expression. The captain had fallen on the bar, and through clouds of cigarette smoke I saw him very slowly cock one eyebrow and let out a deep guttural moan. "Be a boy and crack open that bottle, Brownie," he slurred, eyes firmly closed. "I need the kind of drink I can feel beaming its way into my stomach." By the time I'd turned around fully, Brownstone had bitten off the boxing gloves. "I could drink up the sea," he went on. "I am the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon. I'm shattered when I'm unchained from my sunshine." And then, turning to me to press the matter further, "God grant that no such time may ever come to break you with the sunshine of your life." With this, Brownstone made himself into the shape of a small side table, and rested a glass of the captain's rum neatly on the soft pad of his outstretched foot. Morgan gave him a brotherly kiss on the cheek, before knocking back the treat. "It moves away from me all of the time. Sends me plunging, it does, constantly. In all directions, straying through an infinite nothing, I am. Without it, I'm in full sight of the great problems thrown up by mankind. How can I ground morality and locate a sense of meaning? How could I orientate myself through life's rapids without my sunshine?" Morgan knocked back the remainder of the rum, laid down, and went into flat line mode. Through the gloom, I could just make out a motionless, silent cadaver in a large black hat. I tiptoed across the boards. Captain? Are you there, Captain?" There was no response from him, so I spoke louder. "Captain, it's time to wake up. Who's sailing this boat?" He remained totally unmoved, and when I lifted the brim of his hat, he didn't appear to be breathing. With mounting hysteria, I knelt beside him. I shook him one way, while Brownstone shook him the other. "Oh, Captain, wake up!" Brownstone whispered in his own soppy way. "You got to go to work, Captain. Wake up!" In a second he sat bolt upright and placed his order in a perfect Scottish accent. "I'd like porridge, whole wheat toast, orange juice, and a large pot of strong coffee." I was so relieved that he was still alive, I almost tried to arrange it. "You see, I had a lot of time to think whilst I was in the Navy, and arrived at dependency completely by default, you know," he announced mischievously, spitting each syllable with exaggerated voiced projections, before standing up and appearing through the deck mist like an apparition. Brownstone, nestled in the oil stove warmth of his armpit, watched the satisfying glint of old silver as it shone through the captain's threadbare pocket. "La-dee-dee, la-dee-da, la-dee-dee." Brownstone hummed softly to himself, stopping occasionally to blow his cold, wet nose on the captain's sleeve, who promptly whipped a nosebag onto the wretch and took some proper time to inspect him. He'd fought him hard in the last hijack and wanted to make sure that his remaining tooth was still in place. After he'd removed his finger from Brownstone's mouth, he handed him a single silver coin. "Wash the dirt off and curry that," Morgan said with a grin. Brownstone snatched the silver from the captain's hand, hefted it, and struck it for colour on his tooth. "This'll do for two," he said. "Then have one yourself," said the captain. Brownstone smiled a toothy grin and dribbled on his chin. "A little early for me. Maybe later, thanks." "Don't have one, then," snapped the captain, as he sniffed at the small wax-paper parcel pressed inside his knotty hand, and began galloping around in a circle like a horse would go. I couldn't believe my eyes at first. He was holding 2 pewter plates and clapping them up. The whole scene became an unutterable mixture of comedy and pathos. When Brownstone complained of the raucous noise, he was received back up under Morgan's armpit and petted like a sort of vulpine prodigal son. Morgan examined his ears with the tenderest solitude. "There! I knew the poor chap would get himself into some kind of trouble in the bins. Said it all along. Your head's all cut," he declared, "and full of splinters. He's been a-getting in some bloomin' rubbish again. It's a shame they keep filling them with broken bottles. I sometimes wish I could just lock him up in a cage with a large piece of meat to keep him satisfied. He'd be as happy as a wholly fatted calf," he said gently, patting Brownstone's head until he winced, and suddenly it all kicked off. A tender spot fettled in the wrong direction, and Brownstone's previously contented face distorted into a twisted rictus of pain. Without an instant's pause, he made straight for Morgan's throat with a dinner fork plucked from the table. I saw it look dangerous and pulled back. Morgan tried to push some distance between the two of them. "Calm yourself, Horatio! Calm yourself, boyo!" But he was too quick and too strong, and before Morgan could get his balance, Brownstone pronged him quite severely. Scooping up a tuft of hair, he began a strenuous pulling at the patch, trying to shovel it out from the roots. Before he had done any real damage, Morgan countered him with a swingy right hook, and they went brawling the length of the cabin before sprawling on the floor together. With the speed and ferocity of the fight, Morgan lost a grip of his little packet of sunburnt powder. It seemed to float down like a feather and settled on the decking beside them. At that, Morgan didn't seem to be intent on any further effort. Whilst keeping a wary eye on Brownstone, who was lying prostrate on his belly, he held onto his hair, leaned onto his shoulder, and began licking at the parcel like a dog. Brownstone was wakened, and to my surprise easily secured, by 2 crew members, who girded up their kilts before putting him in a double headlock, which only served to make him drowsy. "I'll just have a little sleep here, then. I'm sleeping now anyway." Morgan was wasting no time. "I cannot afford to lose any sunshine at present. I've lost too much of late for my own physical good, and the prolonged strain of Brownstone's fits and his horrible phases, it's telling on me. I'm overexcited and weary. I must rest, rest, rest." While Morrison arranged some flowers in the porthole, Morgan took the subdued Brownstone to their cabin, asking him the age-old question on the way. "I've been thinking some more about the operation, Horatio. What would you do if I cut you free?" Brownstone thought for a moment, and then answered with a very pretty manner of politeness. "Why, I would kiss you all over again, Captain." The new and brilliant ideas that were constantly forming in the captain's mind would leave the earlier, seemingly hapless ones to dissolve in thin air, and before too long everything began to feel as though it was built on shifting sand. Nothing seemed solid or reliable, or entirely real for that matter. The more I wanted to believe in the value of one of his ideas, the more likely it was to be a mirage. The normal responses that I usually pay to human beings, involving sentiments such as hope and trust, were deactivated, and I began to feel like I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I couldn't play the game anymore, but could I just run away? That would mean that this group of creatures, even the good and likeable ones, had become disposable to me, like off-the-shelf products. They were so peculiar, so familiar with each other's movements that when it became clear that they were going to fall over, they stood perfectly still and sang an old sea shanty to each other until the feeling went away. Looking around the decks, I was struck by how many of the resurrection men, those intact and those who were missing limbs, were wearing kilts. They wore them night and day, and even when the hot rays were being cast towards them, covered themselves with thick tartan and leather aprons to protect themselves and make them less visible to the enemy, they claimed. There came a full red sun, from time to time broken by heavy black driving clouds that suddenly threw the tableau of sea into a rushing diorama of carmine and carbon as we sailed across with all engines at full speed. Steaming across the waters on a costly mission to deliver the priceless antiques in the hold to the countless dealers in Eternal, the gigantic cargo ship Tatiana had been sunk by the king's forces, and now, due to the speed of her impact, was buried deep in a bank of mud at the bottom of the Cypherian Trench. And for the past 2 weeks, 100 or so plastic people had lain there, gathering silt. The crew of the Treherbert had taken to the deepest salvage operation in their history to relieve the Tatiana of its cargo to help fund the rebellion. On deck, the clanging of the bell marked each crashing wave, while the shudder of crashing timbers rocked all aboard, lashing salty froth across the decks, tipping and dropping, pitching the boat stern over prow. The boat heeled even more, and as the black water came cascading over the side, it brought with it a huge, fat sea creature. I stepped round its bulbous body as it writhed around the deck in shapes resembling that of an octopus, with skin like red leather, and its long, gluttonous tentacles thrashing and coiling wildly round me on the boards. I got too close, and came face to face with 2 large, intelligent eyes that gave it the hint of a man. He had plenty of life in him. He seemed to be regarding me with a wicked interest. As I jumped over its tentacles, I heard it making a loud purring noise, coiling and uncoiling its tentacles, moving consciously towards me. I looked for a way to jump out of its way, but a spiralling leg shot up around my ankle. In another moment, another tentacle had whipped around my wrist, but by frantic effort I managed to beat it off. To draw its attention, Grace whistled and fixed its gaze by rolling her head rapidly from side to side before beating it to death with a splintered oar. Morgan shouted across the deck, "Oh, they like a bit of pale meat, they do. Had 2 of us in already this year." The searchlight lost the winch as it fell away from its chain. The sound filled the hull, and a sail torn out of control went flapping around like the wings of a storm-tossed bird. In between the inrushing of spray, resurrection men flew around like headless chickens. Frosty was a man of treasure, and if, even for a short period, there was no treasure, his spirit would go on the decline. There was only one way to deal with it. He bit the top off a cider bottle, and I watched his Adam's apple bounding around his neck as he swallowed the entire contents in a short series of grinding glugs. He wiped the froth from his moustache, and once the pretty lights were back up in his eyes, he sprang into action and lit the first cigar of the day, gripped it in his teeth, and hit the deck hard to warm up with a new routine. He started with 30 slow press-ups, lingering over each one so that the winch chain around his neck made a dragging noise on the boards. Just as the sound of his groaning was becoming too much, he rolled over on his back and turned a barrel over and over on the soles of his feet, racing it around until his calf muscles screamed. He jumped to his feet, and after running on the spot for 30 seconds, went over to arm curls using a grapple iron. I should have guessed by the black clouds that there was a disaster looming. Suddenly, a legion of skyships were above us. The noise of a whole wing of bombers was like a thunderstorm. Even knowing his powers, I couldn't quite handle what I was seeing. The king had sent his most feared type of battleships to intercept the Treherbert before it could get anywhere near the cargo. 7 dreadful zeppelins, all bearing the winged eagle's head on the fuselage, subsonic Type O destroyers that were turning lead to anti-gravity. Commanded by squadron leader Braun, his crew flew with a fine arrogance and were dedicated to their duty to bring about total obliteration of the contraband antiques. Battle lines were drawn, and the men of the Treherbert began loading up with enough subutex to knock the sun down from the sky. When the first death ray came fixed upon the boat, the shock of the men was telling. They waited breathless. In a moment all hell broke loose. There came a huge blast, and the men scattered, dashed by the silver flashes and rotating wheels of fire that thrashed round the mast and sails, tearing rigging from wood, while the men desperately raked the column with machine gun fire and rounds of dirty subutex. Captain Morgan had a plan. He would reduce the combined threat of storm and enemy attack by offering up a common target. With the idea that Brownstone might unconsciously perform the important role of ship's lightning conductor, he pulled his trench coat down over Brownstone's eyes, and while he struggled in the darkness, Morgan shouted out to the crew, "To succeed at such a job, a man must have the right qualifications. That volunteer must possess the very qualities which irritate and grind, and possess the yellowest of bellies." With a nagging disquiet he couldn't quite put a finger on, he squeezed Brownstone's head further under the coat and wedged the cleft of their chest up against the mast. The vacuum that came from above sucked with the force of a wild vortex. All of the men had difficulty standing on their feet, and with the rushing and spinning of rope and wood, running up and down ladder, and clinging with grim clasp to the iron stanchions, we were all gripped by the imminent. "The skyships are closing in on us, Frosty," shouted Morrison. "We only live once," said Frosty, his words woolly with smoke. "Well, the rest of you might," he said, keeping his voice indifferent. "I shall live forever." In between the supernal flashes of light and the resulting snapping of a mast, with his teeth he tore off the top of another cider bottle and spat it into the sea. "That was a close one," he said, and after casually taking the last drag on his cigar, he snapped it in two and threw it in after the bottle top. "We can't make it, Frosty. They're spoiling to sink us." "I'm not asking you, Morrison," said Frosty. "Throw on the power, rev her up to 10,000 and keep her steady. I'm dropping another grapple." While the pounding of the engines increased, and the white light zapped all around us, the resurrection men, bending to their various tasks around the boat, looked at each other and smiled. "Frosty'll get us through," they said to one another. "Frosty ain't afraid of shit." "Drop the revs," he yelled at them. Suddenly everything shut down. There was no sound at all. The boat had cut out. In a moment Frosty began fingering a row of complicated dials and switches on the dashboard. He pulled out a faulty switch and replaced it with a fishing float. "There," he said. "That should hold it for 10 minutes." He rammed the starter lever down, and the boat fired up into a slow paquet, 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 paquet. With the worst storm in 20 years brewing in the barrel of his mind, he pulled up on the lever slowly until the boat began growling through the walls of water again. "We'll try it from another angle," he shouted. Propping himself against the helm with a bottle in each hand now, he signalled Morrison to cut the engines, and in a caustic moment cursed the King's agents of doom, and Braun's despicable science that was fixed to deprive him of his bounty. Lastly, he cursed me for being so foolish as to bring grace aboard his ill-fated mission. Once the water had stilled, he ordered Morrison to lower the periscope. There was a hiss of hydraulics as the glistening stem of a pole shot down through the ceiling of the bridge. Frosty took a hold of the two handles that stuck out on both sides of the pole and lowered his head to gaze into the eyepieces. Very slowly, he began playing around with the soft focus until the zeppelins came into play. 7 of them, he shouted. A collective hellfire yell resonated round the deck. Come and have a look for yourself, he shouted after me. Get Braun's face in your mind. The panoramic lens had been designed especially for spotting aircraft. The glass on the top was bigger than a football. On the pressing of a button there was a huge release of compressed gas, and the pole shot skyward. Up and up and up it went. After what seemed like an eternity, I was faced with a curious picture. A bird's-eye view through the windscreen of the biggest skyship. I was staring at an interior that looked as though it had been designed for a Russian oligarch. Swathes of silver leather from a Rolls-Royce Coupe de Ville, covered seats the size of sofas. Sitting right at the helm was Braun, a servile man with ham fists that guided the ship's big wooden wheel, and his stern face like a gibbous moon perched atop a blue military suit. The periscope was so clear I could see every last detail. His coarse black hair cut to the blue with mechanical clippers, those small porcine eyes trained to watch over prison camps and decipher minute movements on distant horizons, the specks of dust on his thick monocle, the grease in the cleft of his chin, and the red laser dot trained on his forehead, glowing a soft rosy red on his white muscular skin. "Push the red button, man!" Frosty shouted to me. What will happen? It'll send him a bunch of flowers and a thank you card. What do you think it'll do? He shouted. In that moment, the strangest thoughts cruised around in my mind. What if it was all a complicated plot to put me in the frame for Braun's murder? Was I sailing into a trap from which the only escape would be to admit cowardice? In a split second, I'd covered every conceivable angle in my mind, and with a pulse of urgency coursing through my veins, I jammed the button for all my life. Boom! We all watched the fiery splinters and charred fragments of fuselage flutter gently down over the boat. The sea-weary scroats rallied themselves around the winch, and we listened to the tired, steady beat of the propeller against the dark waves, as once again we turned our thoughts to what lay below the ocean. Ankle-deep in hissing brine, and breathing in the fuel-filled vapour, they all began labouring again. I watched as the chain tore down through the water, with the pace of the lynx accelerating down into the murk. The chain's tension strained, cracking timbers and tempers as she went. Finally, the grapple hook took a hold. I stared at the line and the patch of water, and the fins of the sharks that circled the boat. Then suddenly the boat itself began to rotate. The sharks disappeared into the blackness, the boat dipped hard, and a torrent of foam rushed across the deck. The whole crew watched the breathing swell of water coming up all around us. With the sound of the ship's bell hanging in the air, the white beam from the spot lamp fled and halted and swept anxiously around the waist. All around me white streaks swept upwards towards the sky. Frosty turned and shouted, "She's hit something!" He pointed to starboard. "Bring the light around!" The engine dropped to a steady thrum. A wall of water lifted all around us, and suddenly the deck of the boat seemed to press against my feet. The rocking of the boat grew stronger and stronger, until Frosty cried, "Treasure ahoy!"